What happens in the spiritual realm when you fast and pray? When you engage in a fasting and prayer, remarkable things happen in the unseen spiritual realm. This idea is illustrated powerfully in the story of Moses and the Amalekites from the Bible. It's a story that goes beyond just a physical battle and reveals how obedience to God's physical commands can unleash spiritual power. In Exodus chapter 17, we see the Israelites fighting against the Amalekites. God commanded Moses to go up on a mountain and lift his hand towards heaven. God instructed him to keep his hands raised as a sign of obedience. As long as Moses obeyed and kept his hands up, the Israelites would prevail in the battle. However, if his hands started to lower, the tide would turn, and the enemy would gain the upper hand. This may seem like just a simple act of raising hands, but in reality, it was a profound act of obedience. The physical obedience of Moses was directly tied to spiritual release. What Moses did with his body, his posture, and his act of raising his hands determined whether or not the Israelites would win the battle. This story underlies a critical spiritual truth. Physical obedience leads to spiritual release. You might think, if God is going to win the battle, then He'll win regardless of what we do. However, this story shows us that God sometimes requires us to do something physical as a sign of faith and obedience. The connection between physical actions and spiritual outcomes is something that continues to hold relevance in our lives today. The story of Moses is significant because it highlights the connection between our physical actions and the unseen spiritual world. As long as Moses physically obeyed God's command to keep his hand raised, angels were released into the battle to assist the Israelites. However, if his hands started to lower, the angels would withdraw and the enemy would gain an advantage. In Hebrews chapter 1 it says that angels are sent out to minister to those who inherit salvation. Angels are described as spiritual beings, flames of fire, sent to assist and serve God's people. This passage reminds us that there are divine forces at work in the unseen realm, ready to be dispatched when acting faith and obedience. Moses' physical act of raising his hands was more than just a gesture. It was a signal that released angelic assistance. When we obey God with our physical bodies, we tap into spiritual power that we may not fully comprehend. The story of Moses and the Amalekites reminds us of the importance of physical obedience in the spiritual realm. This is why God sometimes asks us to perform physical actions as acts of faith. It's not about the action itself, but what the action represents, a heart of obedience and submission to God's will. Many of us have reduced our spiritual lives to feelings and intellect, thinking that it's enough to worship God in our hearts. However, God often requires outward expressions of faith and obedience. We may feel humble on the inside, but that doesn't mean we don't need to physically bow before God. We may feel love for the Lord, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't raise our hands in worship or clap in praise. If you only told your spouse, "I love you" on the inside, but never showed any outward signs of affection, they would begin to doubt the sincerity of your love. In the same way, God sometimes requires outward physical expressions of our faith before He releases His spiritual blessings. Physical obedience brings about spiritual release, just as it did for Moses. One of the most powerful acts of physical obedience is fasting. Fasting is a way of physical humbling ourselves before God, denying our flesh in order to seek Him more fervently. When we fast, we are engaging in a physical act that can lead to spiritual breakthroughs. Fasting is an act of sacrifice. By giving up food or other comforts, we are demonstrating our willingness to place God first in our lives. There is a powerful connection between what we do physically for fasting and what God does spiritually in response. When you fast and pray, you are aligning yourself with God's will in a profound way. You are opening the door for spiritual power, favor, protection, healing, and miracles to be released in your life. Fasting has the power to unlock heaven's resources and bring about supernatural change. There's a saying that goes, "Higher levels, higher devils," implying that the more you grow in your faith, the more opposition you'll face from the enemy. While there is some truth to this, it's important to remember that as you rise to new spiritual heights, you also gain more angelic protection. Think about it. Who is more protected on a battlefield, a private or a 5-star general? The general has a higher rank and more soldiers protecting him. Similarly, the more responsibility God entrusts to you, the more divine protection and assistance you'll receive. In the Bible, we see an example of this in the story of Elisha. When his servants saw that they were surrounded by the enemy, he panicked, and Elisha prayed that God would open his servants' eyes, and suddenly the servants saw that they were surrounded by chariots of fire, angelic beings sent to protect them. The higher you call in, the greater the divine protection that surrounds you. So don't be afraid to dream big, to step out in faith, and to pursue the things God has placed on your heart. With each new level of spiritual growth comes an increase in angelic protection and participation in the assignments God has given you. In Daniel chapter 10, we see another example of how physical obedience in the form of fasting can bring about spiritual release. Daniel had been fasting for 21 days, eating only vegetables and drinking water. During this time of fasting and seeking God, an angel appeared to him. The angel told Daniel that from the very first day he set his heart to seek God, his prayers had been heard. However, there was a delay in the spiritual realm. A demonic principality had resisted the angel for 21 days. But because Daniel continued to fast and pray, reinforcements were sent in the form of the archangel Michael. This story shows us that there is a spiritual battle taking place in the unseen world, and our prayers and fasting can influence the outcome of these battles. When we fast, we are aligning ourselves with God's will and positioning ourselves to receive His help. As Daniel persisted in fasting and prayer, the angels were able to break through the resistance and bring the answer to his prayers. It's important to understand that while God's love for us is unconditional and unchanging, His favor operates differently. God's love is constant, but His favor is something that can increase in our lives based on our obedience and faithfulness. God's love is freely given to us, regardless of our actions. However, His favor often requires us to take steps of faith and obedience. Daniel's life is a great example of this. During his 21 days of fasting, Daniel experienced an increase in God's favor. The angel even referred to him as greatly beloved or greatly desired by God. This wasn't because God loved Daniel more than anyone else. It was because Daniel's physical act of fasting and prayer caught God's attention, and as a result, he experienced a greater measure of favor. Fasting and obedience can position us to receive more of God's favor and blessings in our lives. In today's church, we often downplay the importance of physical obedience. We may feel that since God knows our hearts, we don't need to express our faith through physical actions. However, the Bible clearly shows that there are times when God requires us to act in faith through physical means. God may ask you to raise your hands in worship, to kneel in prayer, or to fast as a sign of obedience. These physical acts are not just symbolic, they carry spiritual weight. When we obey God physically, it can release spiritual power, favor, and blessings into our lives. When the disciples asked Jesus why they couldn't cast out a demon, He gave them two reasons: unbelief and a preserved spirit. He explained that they were disconnected from God and too connected to the world. The solution, he said, was fasting and prayer. Prayer reconnects us to God, while fasting disconnects us from the world. Together, fasting and prayer have the power to break strongholds, overcome unbelief, and bring us back into alignment with God's will. In the spiritual realm, our physical actions have a direct impact on the outcome of spiritual battles. Whether it's raising our hands in worship, fasting, or kneeling in prayer, these acts of physical obedience can release spiritual power and bring about God's favor, protection, and a blessing in our lives. So as you fast, pray, and seek God, remember that your physical actions matter. They open the door for spiritual breakthroughs and invite God to work in powerful ways on your behalf. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and write comment, Christ is King. And remember that Jesus loves you.